It began in the marbled silence of the Supreme Court chamber, where tradition towered above reason and words could cut sharper than any blade. The occasion, a rare joint hearing between senior members of Congress and the Supreme Court on the erosion of constitutional interpretation in modern policymaking. Cameras were banned, but pens scratched like thunder, and every breath hung heavy with history. At the long central bench sat Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, stoic, brilliant, the first black woman on the court, and someone Jasmine Crockett deeply respected. But today, admiration had no seat at the table. The two were not enemies, but they weren't aligned. Not today. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked in with her signature composure, a navy suit, natural curls pinned back, and eyes that missed nothing. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to confront what she called the weaponization of legal ambiguity. A junior senator had just finished a monologue so thick with Latin and selective precedent it bordered on parody. That's when Jasmine stood. She spoke not to the room, but to Justice Jackson herself. "Justice," Jasmine began, her voice precise, "when you cite Marbury, you do so to defend judicial review, but do you acknowledge how that precedent has been twisted to validate judicial activism hiding behind neutrality?" The room stiffened. It wasn't an attack. It was a challenge. Ketanji raised an eyebrow, slightly caught off guard. "That depends on who's doing the twisting," she replied calmly. "And what if the twisting," Jasmine pressed, "is happening on this bench?" That's when the gavel cracked, not metaphorically, literally. Another justice banged it down. "Order." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable had landed with scalpel-like clarity. And for the first time in that chamber, someone wasn't quoting the Constitution to obscure truth, they were using it to demand it. Jasmine sat. No theatrics. Just fire beneath the surface. Ketanji looked at her for a beat longer than expected. Something had shifted. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had faced verbal gymnastics from senators, evasive litigators, and politicized clerks. But this was different. Jasmine Crockett wasn't grandstanding, she was cutting through something. And Ketanji felt it. For a moment, the room simmered in an uneasy quiet. The usual balance, deference to the court, ceremony over substance, had cracked. Jasmine hadn't violated decorum. She'd exposed its hollowness. Ketanji leaned forward, lacing her fingers. "Representative Crockett, I respect your constitutional grounding. But let me ask, when judges interpret evolving precedent, should they not respond to the evolving society?" Jasmine didn't blink. "Yes, Justice. But what happens when evolution becomes excuse? When interpretation stops reflecting the people, and starts shielding power?" Several clerks stopped scribbling. A few gasps slipped from staffers behind the rows. This wasn't a clash. It was a duel of intellect and integrity, and neither side was pulling punches. Ketanji's reply was thoughtful, measured. "You suggest the court has drifted from the Constitution's spirit." "No," Jasmine said. "I'm suggesting some have dragged it." That landed like a thunderclap. One line. No volume. Just truth. The kind that stripped robes of symbolism and exposed the humans underneath. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. But it was Ketanji who nodded slowly. Not in agreement, yet not in dismissal either. More like recognition. She saw the fire Jasmine carried. And in it, a reflection of her own early days, before robes, before restraint. As the session recessed for lunch, Ketanji stood first. She approached Jasmine, soft but direct. "You came here to confront something real." Jasmine didn't smile. "I came here because people don't get to." They didn't shake hands. But they didn't need to. Because a conversation had begun, and neither of them could unhear it now. The lunch break was ceremonial, sandwiches wrapped in formality, whispers behind velvet curtains. But the tension from the chamber still clung to every lapel. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone felt it, Jasmine Crockett had just redrawn the rules of engagement. Inside the private chambers, a group of senior legal clerks huddled over their notes. "Did she actually say the court was shielding power?" one asked. "She said what we all tiptoe around," another replied. Back in the main hall, Jasmine walked with purpose. Not like a rebel storming the gates, but like someone who had always known the gates were made of glass. Her phone buzzed. A message from a former professor. That wasn't a question, that was a lesson. As they re-entered the chamber, the air was different. Jasmine took her seat, but this time, she didn't initiate. Ketanji did. "Representative Crockett," she began, her tone still judicial but touched with something else. "Respect? Curiosity? You raised a concern about judicial neutrality. I'd like to hear your solution. That wasn't scripted. That wasn't safe." Jasmine leaned forward slightly. Neutrality mustn't be confused with silence. If a court refuses to name injustice while hiding behind precedent, then it's not neutral, it's complicit. The phrase echoed like a bell that refused to stop ringing. A few justices shifted uncomfortably. One even whispered something to a clerk. But Ketanji didn't look away. She nodded, just once, but it was loud enough for the room. "And who defines injustice?" she asked. Jasmine paused, her first real pause. "The Constitution doesn't define injustice. It reveals it, when read with courage." That's when it happened. One justice dropped their pen. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just quoting law, she was wielding it. And Ketanji, behind all the tradition and title, looked at her not as a firebrand politician, but as a peer. No robe could shield that truth. By the time the session resumed, the mood had fractured. Gone was the sterile dance of rehearsed legalese. What remained was something raw, uncontainable. Ketanji Brown Jackson and Jasmine Crockett had turned a static hearing into a living, breathing reckoning. Justice Alito tried to pivot. "Let's return to the matter of statutory deference," he said flatly, eyes avoiding Jasmine. "The Chevron doctrine." But Jasmine cut in, not loudly, but precisely. "Chevron deference," she said, "isn't the problem. It's the comfort it's given lazy lawmakers and evasive justices alike." Gasps. Audible ones. Again. Ketanji raised her eyes, not in disapproval, but like someone watching a storm roll in and secretly rooting for it. There was no contempt on her face. Only calculation. Recognition. Maybe even a trace of pride. "Let her speak," Ketanji said quietly, but clearly. That shocked even Jasmine. For a brief moment, the two women weren't separated by robes or rows of benches. They were simply two daughters of American struggle, black, brilliant, uninvited to the table until they made one. Jasmine continued. "The legal system was not designed with us in mind. But that doesn't mean we won't reshape it in our image." That line didn't land, it detonated. Some in the room whispered, "That's too far." Others? They whispered, "It's about time." Ketanji didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was deliberate. Strategic. She was letting Jasmine torch the room because part of her wanted to see what would rise from the ashes. Two women. One fire. And somewhere in the gallery, a young law student scribbled one word in all caps. Revision. The temperature in the room wasn't rising, it had already erupted. But the flame was no accident. Jasmine Crockett had come in with a matchbook of truths and picked her moment with precision. Each phrase had been loaded. Each silence, intentional. Now, even the most senior justices, those wrapped in decades of institutional comfort, looked visibly unsettled. They weren't used to being spoken to like this. They weren't used to someone knowing the law this well and being unafraid to weaponize it for justice. Justice Barrett shifted in her chair. "Are you suggesting the judiciary is complicit in legislative failure?" she asked, tone clipped. Jasmine turned to her without blinking. No. I'm saying the judiciary has too often stood silent while that failure became law. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. Ketanji didn't interrupt. She sat back slightly, fingers steepled under her chin. Her eyes never left Jasmine. You studied under Bell, didn't you? She finally asked, her voice more human than it had been all day. Jasmine nodded once. And I remember his warning. The law bends to power unless people make it feel the weight of truth. A pause. A heavy one. Then Ketanji said something no one expected. Then make us feel it. That wasn't condescension. It wasn't challenge. It was invitation. Jasmine stood, only this time not to confront, but to clarify. If this court truly believes in constitutional interpretation, then stop interpreting injustice into silence. Because we hear the quiet, and we're done letting it echo. Someone near the back whispered, "This is history." They were wrong. This was correction. And Ketanji? She let it happen. No gavel fell. Because the fire had already spread. The chamber didn't return to business as usual. Because usual had been shattered, quietly, brilliantly, by a voice that didn't rise, but carried weight like thunder held in a closed fist. Justice Gorsuch tried to recover. This proceeding was meant to review legislative judicial tension, not relitigate judicial integrity. Jasmine turned to him with razor focus. Then perhaps the integrity wouldn't be in question if the tension wasn't buried under centuries of silence. Even Ketanji winced, just slightly. It was a masterstroke. And Gorsuch knew it. He pursed his lips and looked down. Cameras weren't allowed in the room. But if they had been, millions would have witnessed what happened next. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the mic, not to attack, not to debate, but to deliver a final truth. When a judge cloaks cowardice in robes, she said, that robe doesn't sanctify the silence. It stains it. Pin drop silence. 4-5 full seconds. Even the marble column seemed to lean in. Ketanji's eyes locked on hers. A faint breath escaped her, like someone watching a storm hit the shore and realizing she no longer had to hold back the tide. She didn't object. Didn't interrupt. Instead, Ketanji spoke. There is power in dissent. But there's even more in precision. Thank you, Representative. That wasn't flattery. That was acknowledgement. From one legal warrior to another. Jasmine nodded once. She didn't linger. She didn't gloat. She simply gathered her notes, turned, and walked out of the room she had just transformed. The gavel never fell. Because the court hadn't ended the session. Jasmine had. Outside the chamber, the air felt heavier, like the gravity of what just occurred hadn't finished landing. Reporters circled like hawks near the barricades, guessing what might have happened inside. But no one really knew. Not yet. Jasmine stepped onto the steps of the court alone. No aides, no entourage. Just her. And that was enough. Someone shouted a question, "Representative Crockett, did you just accuse the Supreme Court of complicity?" She didn't even pause. No. I accused it of consistency. Flashbulbs popped. Cameras clicked. But Jasmine kept walking. Inside, Ketanji remained seated. Still. Reflective. She's not here to break things, Justice Sotomayor whispered beside her. She's here because we haven't fixed them. Ketanji nodded slowly. She remembered her own Senate hearings, how she'd tempered her voice, masked her frustration, bent herself into credibility. Jasmine hadn't bent. Jasmine stood. And in doing so, she'd done what the robes around her rarely dared, told the whole truth, without trimming its edges. Down the hallway, a junior clerk who had been watching from the shadows texted his law school group chat, Jasmine Crockett just rewrote what constitutional confrontation looks like. And Ketanji didn't stop her, she made room for her. Later that night, legal scholars debated the moment on every network. Was it disrespectful? Historic? Dangerous? But in a quiet office in D.C., Ketanji watched the replay in silence. And when the pundit on screen said, Representative Crockett's conduct was unorthodox, Ketanji finally spoke. She wasn't unorthodox, she said. She was necessary. Because in a courtroom where tradition is weaponized, sometimes truth doesn't wear a gown. Sometimes, it wears no robe. And carries no gavel. But it still reshapes power. By the following morning, the ripple had become a wave. Headlines blared across political feeds. Crockett confronts the court. Justice meets Jasmine. A legal reckoning on the record. But no one could quite categorize what had happened. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a disruption. It was an exposure. Jasmine Crockett hadn't attacked the court, she'd undressed it, stripped it of ritual, and held up the Constitution like a mirror. At a Georgetown panel discussion the next day, a constitutional scholar spoke carefully. What Representative Crockett did yesterday wasn't just brave, it was clarifying. The court can no longer claim neutrality when someone names the silence in the room. Meanwhile, in a small room inside the Supreme Court building, Ketanji Brown Jackson reviewed the official transcript. She read Jasmine's words again. If a court refuses to name injustice while hiding behind precedent, then it's not neutral, it's complicit. Ketanji whispered it aloud. That line. That one line. It was already being taught in lecture halls. Already being dissected in op-eds. Later that week, Jasmine spoke at a legal roundtable. She didn't mention the Supreme Court by name. She didn't need to. What I said, she told the room, wasn't controversial. It was overdue. And then, with a signature Jasmine pause, she added. You don't ask for permission to name what's broken. You just do it. And if they call it radical, that only means you got close to the root. Ketanji saw the clip online. She didn't comment. But she shared it. No caption. Just fire. Because sometimes, history isn't made by those who interpret precedent. Sometimes, it's made by those who become it. Whispers traveled faster than law books. In think tanks, in law schools, in the basement offices of Hill staffers, everyone had the same question. What happens when a sitting representative rewrites the way power speaks to the court? And the answer? Jasmine Crockett. Clips of her testimony had leaked, not illegally, but by deliberate choice. A clerk anonymously posted the full transcript. Within hours, social media turned it into a living document. Her quotes were no longer quotes, they were chants, stitched into protest signs and classroom discussions alike. But the real quake came when Ketanji Brown Jackson broke her own silence. At a small, closed-door session at Harvard Law, she was asked point-blank. Do you believe Representative Crockett crossed a line? Ketanji didn't hesitate. She drew a line. And I believe we were standing on the wrong side of it. You could hear jaws hit the floor. It was the moment that transformed Jasmine's words into something more than critique. It made them legacy. Because it wasn't just a firebrand from Texas pushing boundaries, it was a sitting Supreme Court justice recognizing that the court had grown too comfortable in its robes. Later that night, Jasmine received a message from a law student she'd never met. You said what I didn't know I was allowed to feel. She responded with one line. Now say it louder. And from that point on, the narrative changed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest in that courtroom anymore. She had become its conscience. The Constitution hadn't shaken. But the court had. In the weeks that followed, political panels, legal commentators, even retired judges debated what Jasmine Crockett had done. Some called it disrespectful. Others called it revolutionary. But the truth was simpler, and louder. She had spoken what they feared to hear. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson continued her docket, her opinions as measured and sharp as ever. But those who read between the lines started noticing something different, subtle shifts in how she framed dissent, clearer language on institutional responsibility, firmer tones when discussing precedent. It was as if Jasmine's voice had grafted itself onto the bench, not as influence, but as reminder. At a public forum in Atlanta, Jasmine stood behind a podium. No chamber. No marble. Just folding chairs and community members hungry for justice. They told me, she said, that I went too far. But too far from what? A comfort zone built on silence? The crowd nodded. Some clapped. One person shouted, "Tell it." Jasmine smiled, then grew serious. I didn't go in there to shame the court. I went in there to show it the faces it forgot to listen to. And when I left that room, I didn't walk out alone. I walked out carrying every unheard voice they've tried to drown in formality. In a classroom at Howard University, a professor played that clip to her students. She paused the video, looked up, and said, "This is what it looks like when law remembers who it's meant to serve." Back in her office, Jasmine placed a small, unmarked envelope on her desk. Inside was a single note. Handwritten. No signature. Just 7 words. "Thank you for speaking when I couldn't." She recognized the handwriting. Ketanji. The system hadn't changed overnight. But now, it had a crack in it. And the light was pouring in. In a nation where justice often wears blindfolds and tradition muffles truth, Jasmine Crockett tore the silence wide open. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She stood, firm, unapologetic, and precise. In that marble chamber, surrounded by centuries of precedent and power, she did more than question the system. She clarified it. She made the Constitution breathe again, not as a relic, but as a promise. And Ketanji Brown Jackson, instead of resisting, chose something braver. She listened. This story isn't just about confrontation. It's about correction. It's a reminder that the robe doesn't make the justice. The courage does. And sometimes, it takes a voice from outside the court to remind the nation what justice was always meant to sound like. Jasmine Crockett didn't rewrite the law. She reminded us who it's supposed to protect. And in doing so, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us.